Hello and welcome back to the last part of our little tour around Spain, the last of four. This week we're in northwest Spain, and you may be thinking why we're focusing purely on the northern third of Spain. Simply put, it's because most of the southern regions aren't all that suitable for grape production. They do produce some really nice wines in the south, particularly in cherry country, which we'll look at separately. But most of southern Spain, south of Madrid, the Meseta, is largely dry, quite arid, not suitable for grape production. Some grape wines are produced in little pockets of it, and we might go off the beaten track a little bit another time. But if you think about most of southern Spain, it's where they shot a lot of westerns in the 1970s. That gives you an idea of what the landscape's largely like. There's even some parts of the north that I'm skipping, and we'll come back to another time. But here we're going to look at the lush green Atlantic northwest Spain, starting in Galicia. This region was largely put on the map by Alvarina, which is a grape variety I'm sure you're at least vaguely familiar with. It's become quite fashionable in the last 10-15 years. The name of the area we're looking at first is Rías Baixas. That's the nearest pronunciation in the way it's pronounced. I'm not Spanish, so if you are Spanish, please don't write in and complain. That's quite near enough for our purposes. The Rías refer to little sort of inlets, a bit like small fjords in the landscape. It's very rocky, lots of granite in the area, and it's a very, very different from what you think of if you go sort of further south in the warmer parts of Spain, where you usually go on holiday. The climate here is naturally enough heavily influenced by the Atlantic. It's slightly damper, very windy, cooler than most of Spain, and most of the grapes here are trellised on pergolas. So they're trained overhead, and the grapes hanging down from underneath. This is partly to help with the damp climate, because having the grapes slightly higher up means you get more wind movement around them, and it helps prevent damp. It's also, it has to be said, partly because most of the winemakers here are smallholders essentially. It's quite an agrarian economy, and one of the other reasons for the trellising on pergolas is because they can grow their fruit and veg underneath in the shade of the grapes, so it's partly getting more out of their plot of land as well. Another reason for having the grapes on the pergola system is the grapes hang underneath the grape canopy, and this helps prevent the sunlight getting on them, because grapes are susceptible to sun strike. Even if it's relatively cool, they can still get scorched, which gives you unpleasant off flavours in the grapes. Most of the newer vineyards are now trellised in a more normal system with posts and wires, something called the Geneva double curtain, which allows wider spacing. It was developed around Lake Geneva, which is a similarly cooler, damp area. It just means that, again, you're getting that movement of air around the grapes and they can ripen better. Up until the 1970s, most of the area had been replanted at the government's behest with Palomino, which is another of these workhorse grapes. In sherry country, it's great because it makes a really thin, uninspiring wine, but it's a perfect base for making sherry. But for making wine anywhere else, unfortified, and that hasn't gone through the sherry method, it's really quite horrible. And the government then, from the 60s and 70s onwards, encouraged the locals to replant native varieties, Alvarina in particular, Godello. The other permitted varieties in the area are Torrontés, Caña Blanche, and also Loureira and Treixadura, which you also find just the other side of the Minho River in Portugal, which we'll look at another time. But there's a lot of similarity here between Rías Baixas and the whole of Galicia and Portugal. Until the 1980s, the area was still largely unknown, even though it had been replanted. Because I mentioned earlier, there's lots of small growers here. There's no sort of cohesion. There isn't the sort of history of bodegas or cooperatives to bring wine growers together to make wine in a properly exportable or commercially viable way. Up until about 1986, Martin Kodak's started. Now this is a cooperative of initially about 50-60 growers got together, and it's now sort of over 270, I think, with 300 more families being brought in and grapes purchased from all these different parcels. And they produce consistently good quality Albarino and Godello in the Salnés subzone. It's one of the best areas for Albarino because it's quite near the sea and the river. There's 5 areas in total, sub-areas in Rías Baixas, and 2 of the others are actually on the Minho River, as I mentioned before, just opposite Vinha Verde. And the wines bear a striking resemblance when we look at Portugal another time. And since the 80s, many other producers have come along making Albarino, and we've got here one of the best examples to my mind, the Pasa Senores Albarino. which is, has to be said, one of our customers' favourites as well. It's a lovely wine. So on the nose you've got lovely lemon fruit, lots of citrus blossom, a bit of honeysuckle. Slightly creamy finish. I think it's been left on its lees for a little while, those dead yeast cells, which a bit like Muscadet or Champagne, it just gives it that slightly leesy, lemony, bready aroma on the finish and a little bit more complexity. It's a classic seafood wine. There's great seafood caught in the Atlantic just off the coast from Galicia, and it's a perfect match for whitefish, crustaceans. Some Albarina can be oaked. It takes quite well to oak, and it's a sign of a good quality grape variety that it can take different treatments. I've actually had an Albarino that's been aged in chestnut wood, which was interesting. It gave it a slightly nutty, earthy complexity. Very interesting. If you ever come across one, I've never seen it since. But yeah, worth looking out for. To the east of Rías Baixas, just inland slightly, is Ribeiro. Most of the vineyards here are clustered again around the river Minho. And the grapes here are the same as Rías Baixas, but they're more commonly blended, Trixadura, Albarino, Godello, and labelled Ribeiro rather than being varietally labelled like Albarino. Some reds made here from local grapes, Alicante, not so much with the Mencia that you see further inland, and it's again a bit of a workhorse grape. It can produce some solid wine but nothing particularly interesting. Further east again we come to Ribeira Sacra, which makes it a little more red because obviously as we go inland a little bit we're getting away from the Atlantic. It's a little bit warmer, and a little Tempranillo but more Mencia, and some really good Godello. One of the producers I've mentioned before, Alvaro Palacios, more of him when we come to Bietze in a moment. One of his relatives is actually based in this area, and he makes a really good Godello that we're coming on to next. This family's, particularly at the behest of Alvaro Palacios, has got little holdings all over the place. This is in the last area we'll look at in Galicia itself. This is Valdeorras, and it's Luro de Polo Godello. There is a similarity between Albarino and Godello, but I think Godello has a little bit more body to it. Slightly different aromas. It's more towards the sort of peach and stone fruit and green gage that you'd get in the Chardonnay, for example. And on the palate, it's slightly more honeyed. You've got lovely stone fruit, a little bit of pineapple in there, slightly tropical, almost. To my mind, it's a beautifully textured wine, and it would work really well with seafood, like the Albarino. It's got that lovely acidity, but with a little bit more body, it could work well with a lot of poultry dishes, particularly pheasant. To my mind, I think it would be a good match for. Finally, as we leave Galicia itself behind, we move into Castilla y Leon, and we come to Bietze, which traditionally produce whites and rosés, but it has a lot of old vine Mencia, which was largely overlooked. It just went into rosé production for the most part and made sort of jug wine, but it was rediscovered in the early 80s, and the steep slate slopes here really, so a lot of winemakers' minds resemble Priorat, which in the early 80s was just starting to gain a reputation for its wines from old vines. So those similarities really sparked a lot of interest with this new wave of winemakers. Again, Alvaro Palacios and his family produce a lot of wine in this area. Because we're moving inland even more, Bietze has a really unique microclimate. It's unique in all of Spain in that you get the Atlantic influence and the higher rainfall, but you actually get much warmer summers. So again, it's much more of a red wine area, and it's very rare in Spain to get that crossover of higher rainfall, because usually, as I mentioned before, the rainfall across most of Spain is really low. These slate soils do help with drainage, and they give the wine a real minerality, but actually most of the region is gravelly clay, and for the most part I think it produces wines just as good, because so long as it's got good drainage, I think that's the most important thing, particularly with the slightly higher rainfall. Some Mencia can be quite age-worthy, with a little bit of oak treatment and concentrated from old vines. This example from Bodega Mirayo, the Las Tres Filas, I think it's the Three Brothers, is a really good example. It's fermented in stainless steel and then aged for some time in French and American oak. It doesn't have a particularly overtly oaky aroma to my mind. They've used French and American oak. It's only a small proportion of it is new, or it's second fill oak, so you don't get that overt vanilla component that you get in Rioja. That's not what we're looking for here. Mencia is all about the acidity and the freshness. On the nose, there's lots of slightly darker fruit, damson and mulberry, but also it's one of those awful phrases with pencil shavings. Tim Atkin refers to a lot of so-called wine experts as cork dorks, and I prefer that term because there's a lot of wine speak that seems impenetrable to people who aren't in the trade or talk about wine the whole time. But just taking that as an example, pencil shavings, for me it's got that graphite minerality on the nose. If you think of sharpening a pencil, you get that sort of woody smell, the cedar, and that's from the oak, but also the minerality is from the grape variety itself, as well as the fact that it's been grown in quite sharply drained soils. It retains that freshness and minerality. The vines here are quite old. They're an average age of about 80 years, so you get very little yield from it. And for me, the quality of this wine, given that concentration, is really good. Got a little bit of powdery tannins on the palate, really good acidity, lots of that fruit coming through. It's still a relatively young wine, it's only 2 years old. You could keep it for another 3 to 5 years to develop more of those gamey flavours if you like that kind of thing. But I think it's very age worthy. I'm sure this could easily do 10 years. It's got real structure and depth to it. For me, this would be a really good wine for something like roast pork on the barbecue. A lighter meat, because it's a relatively light wine, but it's got quite strong flavours in there. And the acidity, I think, could really match well with quite fatty pork dishes. For me, the acidity and the little bit of tannins means it could match quite well to quite strongly flavoured pork dishes or baked vegetable dishes. We think of all those strong Mediterranean flavours. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a suitable place to sort of finish in Spain as we're moving into Portugal next, because there's a lot of similarities between this area and Portuguese wines. When we think Portugal, we often think of the Douro Valley and port because of the associations between the port trade and the UK, but I hope this sort of primes you for looking at the wines of Portugal, which are a little bit less understood, I think, in the UK. So we'll look forward to seeing you next time when we look at Portugal. Thank you.